I came away from.
Okay, hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Institute of World Politics. Do pass the coins along, but at the same time, I'd like you to welcome our speaker, Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice is not to be confused with another James Rice who's here. His main focus today, I hope in the future, is going to be the Intermarium. This event today is put on by the Center for Intermarium Studies and the Brzyska Chair in Polish Studies, which I happen to head. Mr. Rice is a legislative director for U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley. He's worked with him since June 2000, so it's been almost 18 years. Well, exactly 18 years.
It's been 18 years as of, I think, yesterday. Maybe yesterday.
Yes. Mr. Rice is interested in the Baltics. Not only, but he works with the Baltic Freedom Caucus. He's interested mostly in the Western post-Soviet zone. He worked in the Iowa Senate. He held an internship with the Conservative Party in Great Britain, thing going on in Canada. And he has worked in various political campaigns. His BA is from Drake University, double major in political science and history. And right now he's pursuing his MA in international relations and statecraft and international relations here at the Institute of World Politics. I would like you to welcome Mr. Rice. And his lecture is based on work he did in our seminar in the spring on Russian politics and foreign policy, which starts, well, the seminar starts with DNA, so it starts thousands of years ago. It started DNA, then it goes through the Vikings, Eastern Slavs, Rus, Ruthenians, and then it proceeds eventually to a muddy little village called Moscow, which having mastered the wickedness of the Mongols has been deploying it ever since against all of its neighbors on all sides. Without much more ado, here's Mr. Rice.
Right, thanks very much. So, so yes, the paper is about Ukraine and its sense of national identity. According to many sources, the name Ukraine itself means borderland. That's apparently disputed, but many people have said that. And so that raises the question of whether Ukraine is a nation of its own right, or just a crossroads between other nations. So, spoiler alert: it is a nation, but it does. You can't ignore the fact that over its turbulent history, it has been influenced and controlled different parts of it by different, very different neighbors and civilizations, and they've all left their imprint. So, going back to the beginning, as Dr. Hodakevich said, we start with the Kievan Rus, which is based out of Kiev. So that's the ancestor of modern Ukraine, from that we had the Mongol invasion, which essentially decimated the population of Ukraine. That civilization sort of collapsed amongst the Mongol invasions. And at that time, during the Mongol invasion, is when Muscovy really rose to prominence through its collaboration with the Mongols. And also as a result of the Mongol invasion, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was able to control much of the western portions of Kievan Rus. And so that started the history of Western civilization having a major influence over what's now Western Ukraine. And that, that divide can be illustrated by the Union of Brest and the formation of the Uniate Church in Western Ukraine. That had and there's some interesting aspects of that, aside from just sort of East-West split, in that during that time there was the Cossacks came to rise to prominence in the south and east, and they were sort of a buffer between the Tatars in the south and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and so we have a situation where you have a sort of Ukrainian polity that is sort of fending itself off from east and west, and you had essentially the Catholic influence from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You had obviously the Tatars and the Muslim influence, and then you had a still an Orthodox heart in Kiev, and you have a polity that's sort of balancing off its neighbors to try to chart its own course, and that is a pattern that I've seen kind of reappear in Ukrainian history, is this notion of it carved its identity out by the fact that it's a crossroads between, there's different countries on all sides, but it's always managed to kind of play its neighbors off each other to chart its own course. So let's see. So who were the Cossacks? They were mostly bands of runaway peasants from other parts, settled parts of Ukraine, who wanted to live their lives free from landlords and imperial governments. So what we have is an independent streak that maybe you can trace to today. Certainly in Russia has a history of autocratic governments and keeping people compliant. The people who didn't like that ended up going to the steppe, which has some interesting parallels to the American frontier, the idea of independent people that want to live their own lives. They go to the frontier, and that's a spirit that I think you can also see in Ukrainian history. The most significant Cossack polity, arguably, is the hetmanate of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. He became a significant political and military force in the mid-17th century. And that, again, that polity proved adept at regional geopolitics. So, for instance, you have an alliance with the Tatars at that time against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So, in the situation in Ukrainian history, there's been a shift in terms of they'll ally with whoever they need to preserve their independence, and that can switch depending on who's the biggest threat at the time. So this also is the first polity that is recorded as being called Ukraine, and where the name Ukraine comes about. And certainly the Cossack identity remains very important for Ukrainians. It's still an important symbol. And Catherine the Great recognized the power of that symbol, because when she abolished the hetmanate, she is supposed to have said, quote, "Every effort should be made to eradicate them and their age from memory," unquote, which tells you that she saw that as a threat to the attempt to Russify or eliminate the separate identity of Ukraine. And a later hetman, Ivan Mazepa, was known for being very close allies with Peter the Great. He was considered a very reliable ally. But then, when it suited his purposes, or he thought it did, he switched his allegiance to the Swedish king, Charles XII. So again, we have a situation where he was thought to be, essentially in lockstep with the Russian Empire. But when it made sense, the allegiances switched. We have a situation where the Russians have an attitude toward Ukraine that's doesn't necessarily recognize the separate identity. The Russians refer to them as little Russians. They have this myth that the center of the Rus civilization shifted from Kiev to Moscow in medieval times, and that all the former Rus lands are part of a greater Russia. And ironically, this myth may have been invented by the Ukrainians themselves for their own purposes at a much later time in an attempt to get the Russian Empire to come to the defense of Kiev when it was threatened by Poles and Ottomans. They said, we're the mother of Russian civilization, come help us. Well, they were sort of making that up as a way to lure Russians to help them for their own geopolitical purposes. But there's no evidence really that early Muscovite leaders bought into that, or that appeared much later in history, that myth, which persists to this day. And I talked about this sort of East-West divide, but it wasn't just a division, it was also something that Ukrainians used to their advantage. In the portion controlled by the Habsburg, there was an incentive for the Habsburg Empire to allow the Ukrainian identity to develop as a way of defending against development of a Russian identity. The Russians were trying to Russify the part of Ukraine that they held and create a sense that they're all part of the Russian Empire, and it was a concern from the Habsburgs that those living in Galicia and the Ukrainians essentially under Habsburg rule would identify as Russian. So they were happy to have Ukrainians identify as a separate Ukrainian identity to defend against Russian irredentism, and that gave an opportunity, though, for some cross-border pollination. So the Ukrainians living in the part controlled by Russia would, if the writers would publish then in the Austrian-controlled part, and that helped develop a common literary language amongst all Ukrainians. And then the Ukrainians living in Galicia also used the fear that the Habsburgs had of the Russian kind of influence to get their way and defend their interests within the Habsburg Empire vis-a-vis the Polish minority. The Ukrainians saw them as sort of the biggest cultural threat. The nobility became Polish-speaking under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and so there were a lot of people who identified as Polish and spoke Polish, and there was tension under the Habsburg Empire between those two communities, and in order for Ukrainians to kind of get their way, they would sort of threaten the Habsburgs, like, oh, well, if you don't let us win, then we may end up identifying as Russian, and that's not what you want. So they again sort of playing the larger sort of geopolitical actors off each other to their own purposes. And then, of course, we have the Soviet Union. The Soviets, interestingly, theoretically, the communist ideology is international, so they don't believe in nationalism. But when the Soviets came in, it was important to them to have every citizen have their nationality on their identity card. And they initially, Lenin thought that he could use nationalism to his advantage to win the Russian Revolution, but what you had a situation where you had people with local identities that didn't necessarily identify with the grand nation, and they were essentially forced to adopt a nationality. You had villages where you would say, what is your nationality? What's your people? And they'd say, well, we're Catholic here. Well, that's not a nationality. That's your religion, but that's how they identified. They said, well, or we, and so you have the Soviets come in and say you have to pick a nationality, and so ironically, they essentially helped kind of further nationalism. They also helped that in a way by the Soviets were threatened by the Poles that came under the Soviet control after World War II and the annexation of what's Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. Had a large number of Polish-speaking people as well as Ukrainians. And the Soviets repressed the Poles, and that helped sort of Ukrainize the Western Ukraine and make it even more sort of purely Ukrainian in a cultural and linguistic sense. But then we had Stalin, who saw a threat from nationalism. I've always wondered if that is some relation to the fact that he's from a minority nationality, he's Georgian, but he very much tried to suppress nationalism, and he saw this as a peasant problem. There's a connection between people who come from villages who are very rooted, they know their history, they know their people, and developing a strong sense of identity, and that was important to stamp out if you want to replace it with a Soviet identity. And that helps explain the terror famine, the Holodomor. There was an effort to wipe out sort of that village life. There were deportations where people were moved from western Ukraine to eastern Ukraine or much further east. And so there was an effort to kind of suppress nationality, which was not entirely successful. Western Ukraine is still the center of Ukrainian nationalism. And then you have the Donbass in the east as sort of the other extreme that was much more Sovietized, if you will. It was an industrialized area. People were working in factories. There was more uprooted for village life. There were some in-migration to the area for industrial purposes. And so there's much less of a national identity there. People adopted a general Soviet identity. But it's important to point out that Donbass has a history of having a very local identity, and this, the more recent events. There's sort of the Russians would have you believe that the Donbass is Russian. That's not necessarily the case. They identify locally as they have a Donbass identity. They think of themselves, their interest first. For instance, when during the Russian Revolution, the people in that region supported the anarchists who were tactically aligned with communists during the Russian Revolution. Again, it was sort of a tactical alliance situation. They had their own way of thinking. But then when there was a referendum on independence for Ukraine, there was large margins in the Donbass voted for independence, including ethnic Russians. The Donbass had been an industrial showpiece of the Soviet Union, but they felt exploited by Moscow. They being taken advantage of, and so they thought they could get a better deal with independent Ukraine. And it's interesting that in David Satter, in his book *The Age of Delirium*, he talks about Ukrainian nationalists that have been from Western Ukraine coming to Donbass, trying to mobilize the people, and the reaction, he quotes one person saying, "quote It's all the same to us what language we speak as long as there is sausage," which I think is an interesting encapsulation of the notion. I think it's probably not the case that everybody doesn't care if they change their language, but it is the case that they're interested in their economic well-being, they're interested in what's working for them and how to feed their families, how to make their lives better. Not so much interested in Russian nationalism or Ukrainian nationalism, but how to make their life better. So Donbass is not Russian, but it's also not Ukrainian nationalist. You have to allow for regional differences, and that includes language. That's I think one of the things that we have the folks that are the sort of more Ukrainian nationalists would like everybody to speak Ukrainian. Would like to encourage a stronger sort of traditional European type of nationalism to develop. That's something that is with having a traditional local identity and having been more Sovietized, that's not something that's going to happen overnight, if ever. And you have to recognize that Ukraine, while it is one country and everybody considers themselves Ukrainian, they do have different mentalities in different parts, and so which is fine because the United States has that too. We are a big country that has very different regional characteristics. I'm an Iowan living in D.C., and so it's interesting. I think sometimes Americans, because we have one sort of popular culture and we have theoretically one language with some minor regional differences, we think we're all kind of the same, and I think that actually papers over our differences. But you definitely, I hang around with a lot of Iowans. We identify with each other, and there is a cultural difference between the Midwest and Washington, D.C. And that's the solution to that. That was the case in the 13 colonies. The United States adopted a system of federalism because we were a diverse country from the beginning, and not just because of immigrants. We also had, in fact, one of my favorite books is the Albion Seat, the 4 British Folkways in America. That talks about 4 different regions from Britain that all settled different parts of the United States, and you can still keep those cultural continuities to today. You can see where different places on the East Coast where they arrived and then where they migrated to across the country, you can still see that there are cultural differences that carry to today related to those original four, all from Britain, but different regions of Britain with different cultural backgrounds. And so, you know, that's why we have a system of federalism that allows for difference. You don't, everybody has to have the same thing at the same time. And you can still have one country with one loyalty. I think sometimes European-style nationalism can get too focused on, we have to have a very unitary government that, you know, we're one people, we have to have everything the same. If you do have a country where people have you know, different regions, you know, the one party in Ukraine is called the Party of Regions, and it's the one that appeals to folks in the East, and it's also the more pro-Russia party. It'd be nice if maybe the pro-Western party could accommodate some of the regionalism without losing, that doesn't mean you have to lose a sense of national identity and pro-Westernness. So that's just my 2 cents as an American. But I think a unifying factor can be this sort of Cossack identity. You know, I'm attracted to it perhaps because of the notion of a frontier. It sounds familiar to Americans, but it's sort of there's the notion of a independent-minded people from a lot of different backgrounds that just want to, you know, sort of live free. That can be a unifying sense of identity in and of itself. That doesn't mean everybody has to have the same, speak the same language or have the same thing for dinner every night. You know, it's you can have that independent streak can be a unifying factor, but it also obviously means that people are going to be different. I think one. In my paper and my talk, I've talked a lot about sort of Galicia and the Donbass as sort of these extremes. I don't mean to imply that there's a dividing line right down the middle and there's just two identities or two ways of thinking. Ukraine is more diverse than that, and I think on a positive note, the area around Kiev is linguistically it's essentially bilingual. So you've got Ukrainians sort of in the west and more Russians in the east, but in Kiev people speak both languages. It isn't a problem. It isn't really it isn't an issue. So it can work. You can have one country where there's two languages, maybe some different mentalities, different regional differences, but still all be, you know, essentially one nation with one one foreign policy, and that's essentially what my paper is about. If anybody has questions? Yes.
How old is Moscow? How many years when this city was established?
What's that?
Moscow, capital of Russian Federation.
Yes.
When it was established?
I mean, that I don't have exact date for you because it's
Okay,
not really. What's that?
About a month ago, a book came out in Kazakhstan claiming that it was the Kazakhs who established Moscow was his name. So they claim it was something around the 8th century or maybe 9th.
Okay.
But Yuri Dolgoruki came to Moscow in the 11th century.
Okay, first time in the manuscript, it was village, you don't know Boyarin, but Kuchka. It's 1147.
Okay.
Again, Moscow approximately 900 years old. What about Krakow? Polish. Because Warsaw now is capital, but Warsaw is relatively young city. Krakow is in 1,000. Yeah. What about Kiev? Kiev, even in Soviet time, in 60s, it was celebration. 1,500 years old city. In some documents, in Byzantium, in Rome, 2,100 years old. How come you follow pro-Russian way, pro-Soviet way, call that Ukraine is Borderland? You don't know meaning words Ukraine. It's Russians and Polish suddenly, they try to convince it's H. No, we are not an H. Not him, not me. I'm, by the way, from Donbass. When I hear you about this different mentality, no, it's different mentality from Washington and from Moscow, because both countries does want to see strong Ukraine.
Yeah.
Both countries. You know why?
That's what I agree with everything you said. I think the point I was making is that the narratives we're hearing that that it's not one country or that there isn't a single Ukraine are not accurate. And that
everybody who hates Ukraine, subconsciously or something, they start from Kiev and Rus. Kiev and Rus is only a short episode in our history.
okay.
Before Kiev and Rus, it was Russian Crimea, Surozh, Ukrainska Rus. Before that, in Donau, Danube. Before that, believe it or not, Nori in Pannonians, today Hungary. And before that, in Provence, in France. Believe it or not. Yeah. Because according to the British anthropological expedition who worked now 4 years in Ukraine, they take samples from thousands of people. Ukrainians, not Slavic people. 40% blood is Celtic blood. And 40% is Goths, who came from Borderland in 2nd century.
Yep.
And
It was
only 10%
founded by Swedish.
And 6% Semitic blood. Okay. It means when in all universities around US, France, I travel around the world, read Russian book, by the way, when people in today's Moscow start calling themselves
Okay, I'm sorry, this
Russian.
was supposed to be a question, not a lecture. If you'd like to come and lecture, you have to sign up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Last sentence.
Okay, because it'll never end. We had Hungarians who got mad whether they were Turanians or not. Half the room was asleep, the other one scared.
Okay, last sentence. I've been in Ireland many times. People
You have to
say
control the
very
flow.
similar with Ukraine. 6% now speak Gaelic only. 40 years ago, 10%.
Right.
Language decreased, but they are strong nationalists.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. In 2 years, they will celebrate 100 independence. Nobody cares.
Right. So I think again, language is irrelevant, and that was part of the point. Is that just because a Ukrainian might speak Russian doesn't mean that they're not Ukrainian, and that's the Russian narrative, but it's not. Yeah. Oh, I agree completely with that. Yeah. So go ahead.
I'm glad you did this paper. I'm Elaine Soraya. I'm the Associate Director of a private university in Kiev, Ukraine, which is the only university, public or private, which is Western, US, Canadian, European accredited. First of all, have you spent any time, have you gone to Ukraine?
No.
And how much time did you spend in Ukraine, may I ask?
What's that? I said I did not.
Oh, you did not? Oh, really? So that all of your work is sort of a digestion of
Yes.
pre-existing documents that you have
Right.
read, and you have, it's your take on pre-existing documents.
Right.
I see. So you did not go into and doing any research within the country
Mhm.
to do this?
Right.
I see. I would recommend you do that.
I would love to do that.
I think if you did that, you would be very welcome. They really welcome Western scholars, so I highly encourage it. I wonder if you could comment, if you're familiar, on the effect of the war on Ukrainian nationalism through the regions from western to central to eastern Ukraine, developing the sense of identity.
Well, what I've read is that you have that since the war started, you have actually had a decrease in popularity of Russia in the Donbass and an increase in support for the EU and the West. And I think, if anything, it has sort of stoked the sort of nationalism in the West. I've seen pictures of people, of Ukrainian soldiers who have adopted a Cossack hairstyle when doing that. So I think it's actually been a unifying factor. I think it's something that we see even in the politics of Ukraine today, that there's before there was sort of this division around whether we should, whether the country should have a more sort of, friendly to Russia policy or friendly to the EU. That's kind of beyond, irrelevant now. Everybody's rallying around the flag and realizes that if the country is under threat, that takes precedence over, and that's what we see in the United States when we have we had a threat after 9/11. Everybody came together and kind of put aside their differences.
To that point, particularly on the Western Front in Donbass, what we're seeing a lot of is the external force of Russia just trying to exploit the divisions that do exist, just like we have divisions in the States.
Yeah.
This exploitation in Ukraine has been going on for a long time. I frequently liken to Ukraine as being a sort of a testing and proving ground. A lot of what Russia does there in Ukraine in various ways, cybersecurity, breakdowns of systems, infrastructure, banking, finance, medical systems, and the whole disinformation structure it's a practice that makes perfect. We see a practice there for many years, and now we've seen it used around the world, particularly, most noticeably as we hear about it, here in the United States. And with regard to the West, where right after the invasion by Russia in Crimea, which they initially, of course, denied, which was fueled by their forces out of uniform.
Right.
Then there was an immediate takeover, of course, and with that takeover there was the immediate annexation of an area supposedly they had no part in dealing with. So it wasn't about the people there wanting something, it was an invasion.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Now, that of course is then it played out immediately to pull a distraction from that area to the western edge. I mean eastern edge, excuse me, I said western, I meant eastern, in Donbass. There was the exploitation again of, as you mentioned and this gentleman mentioned, the high identity of the people there.
Yeah.
Now, in this case though, as this has dragged on, Russia has tried to move those individuals who were, again, wanting to maybe separate themselves in some way because of their strong identity in Donbass, but suddenly Russia wanted them to adhere to what Russia wanted.
Right. And I say in the paper that I think that backfired. I think that backfired, and I think to an extent they, I don't know if they believed their own propaganda and thought that they would come in and that they would somehow be able to, you know, they would be able to stoke the divisions and work to their advantage. I think it had the opposite effect. I think it had a backlash just because there were frustrations between people in the Donbass and the government in Kiev. Doesn't mean that they wanted to separate or that they were certainly not pro-Russian or identified as Russian. That's certainly not the case. And so I think it's backfired. It seems like a lot of Russia's attempts lately have backfired. They attempted to meddle in U.S. politics. I think that's backfired. And it certainly is. I mean, it is a proving ground. Actually, my main specialty is the Baltics, and I was just in meeting with the Stratcom Center in Latvia and the Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia, and they were talking about how they actually do kind of look at Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine in terms of cyber attacks as a way of, they're using that as a proving ground to defend against the Russian disinformation and cyber attacks. It's also nothing new. This is exploiting divisions in society, something that they did to the United States all during the Soviet times. It's part of the old KGB playbook that's still essentially in use, just using more high-tech and modern methods. So that's, yeah.
Are you seeing other national powers participating in the dynamics? And I specifically am thinking of the Chinese, and with things like their One Belt, One Road initiative, kind of starting to get into the mix as well. And in what way are they doing? What is the early indication to the effect of that?
So the Chinese do have a very intentional strategic effort to exert influence far and wide. They are becoming more involved in the post-Soviet space. I have not looked specifically into what they've done in Ukraine. I know they've been very active in the stands.
I'll tell you very quickly. The Chinese involvement is of long pedigree. They even bought a Ukrainian post-Soviet aircraft carrier and hold it home. Further, they've been buying grain and other food stuff from Ukraine and delivering it to Egypt and the Middle East. The Russians have not interfered. The Ukrainians obviously are stuck because they can't sell their agricultural products in the EU. There are EU regulations, so they can only get rid of it one way or two ways. They can sell their foodstuffs to Russia. China doesn't really care who rules Ukraine. There are elements in the Ukrainian government which hope that they can influence the Chinese to lean on Moscow. The Chinese are happy to be in bed with anybody. Look at the Sudan. They're absolutely morally indifferent to what's going on. They're not going to protect Ukraine. The Poles and others hope, oh, if there's Chinese infrastructure, there's Chinese interest. Yeah, but that means that the Chinese will want to strike a bargain with anybody who will facilitate their activities.
Are the Ukrainians shipping wheat to China?
No, the Chinese buy it and sell it in the Middle East, or deliver it to the Middle East to calm things down, which serves America's purposes too, obviously.
How about
Otherwise,
the Asian Infrastructure
the
Investment
Development
Bank?
Bank?
Yeah, are they investing in Ukraine or no?
I think that they were looking at Kerch and Crimea, not necessarily because of Ukraine, just because whatever can be stable and make money for them.
Correct.
There is some interest in Western Ukraine, but not because they want to support Ukraine or Western Ukrainian nationalism, but because they have a hub in Slovakia and Hungary. They don't have an official hub in Poland.
Right.
So,
Thank
Can I
you.
add to this two things about China? First of all, the vessel which delivered the cable from Russia to Crimea was under Chinese flag. Yeah? And this was German vessel with German equipment, but under Chinese flag. Yeah? Second, at the very end of Yanukovych ruling, there was a plan already signed to take Ukrainian port Saki, which is Crimean port, and this is resort. Yeah, this is like Salt Lake City, for example. Yeah? And to make this port an ocean port, and to deliver 10,000 Chinese agricultural workers to Saki, and to make huge agricultural area to develop rice and other cultures. Yeah? So this was already signed plan, already not even on paper, but already in feasibility studies, etc., etc. And the situation with Maidan, etc., ruined this plan. Annexation ruined all these plans, etc. So China is pretty much involved physically, I would say. Yeah. And there are a lot of Chinese people in Ukraine. The only thing that they're not in Kiev and big cities. They're trying to live in small cities, in suburbs, etc. They don't want to be visible. De facto, there are a lot.
It's interesting because China and Russia both have a way much exert influence, but they have slightly different motivations and ways of going about it, and they're starting to overlap in terms of where they operate. But Russia's attitude is more they want to reestablish or expand the Russian Empire, and the Chinese is less about having a direct imperial involvement as it is exerting great power influence everywhere they can, and sometimes in more subtle ways.
Just as a postscript to what you're saying is, yeah, I think it's interesting. It's not so much that China is looking, I think, to confront Russian influence in that area, as they are trying to set up an axis vis-a-vis former European and Western influence, particularly financially, because they're saying, we're an alternative to the EU rules. We're an alternative to the World Bank, Western-dominated international financial structures.
They would like to supplant the United States and the West as the superpower,
exactly.
And they're
as the
have
axis,
a long-term strategy.
as a financial axis, and I think they're on the move.
True.
This one, 6.
Yeah.
War zone in Donbass, in my city of Lugansk. Last 2 years, 86,000 people moved to the east, Rostov area, to Russia. Yeah, 86,000 people afraid of war. They feel themselves that they are Bashkirs, Tatars from Kazan or Russians. Because mostly 6 million people were moved in 1948 from Central Russia to Ukraine. In 1946-47, this was fourth man-made famine in Ukraine. I remember that. I was born before Second World War. 3.5 million people died. Nobody talking about this famine. 86,000 moves to Russia. Do you know how many people moved to central Ukraine and now try to move to Poland? 1.5 million. 1.5 million people. Not all of them ethnic Ukrainians, but people want to live in European culture.
Right, of course, yeah.
Right. Thank you, Lord. All the government opened the door. And now, how many? Almost millions of Ukrainians. Yeah. It's not language.
No, I agree.
It's not culture. It's freedom.
That's actually part of my point. Yes, and
Situation in Ukraine, economical terrible, but 1,800 newspapers, many independent TV stations. You can stay near residence of president or his office and shout and feel your bastard. This one. Nobody will arrest you.
Yep.
Try do it in Moscow. Something against Putin. You know,
absolutely. Yeah. No, that's absolutely right, and that's actually part of the point of the paper is that explaining what you know. I admire the sort of Ukrainians' independent streak and their and certainly Ukraine has had is a much better tradition of Western style democracy. It certainly hasn't. It has a ways to go to be to perfect it, but I certainly agree that you would much rather.
Sure thing. I asked many people in different sessions, why United States government didn't inform Ukrainian government at least 2 weeks before Russian invasion in Crimea. CIA, all agencies, they gave all information about this invasion to the American government. And US, it like this.
I don't know
It's,
that.
no, okay, it's first. And second, it's very popular now in DC. Try to convince American officials, Ukrainians, all delegations, they bring words in. Decentralization. Decentralization will be very good for Ukraine. No, decentralization will be end of Ukraine. This Morgenthau plan. Morgenthau, you know this name.
I don't know.
Yeah, who want to erase German nation, divided Germany for 20 states, destroyed all industry, potatoes field. It's what exactly Washington now wants to do with Ukraine.
So decentralization has a certain ring to it for Europeans, and I know there's a history, and that's not. I would say I advocate federalism more along American lines. Our United States has a system of federalism, and it hasn't divided us. In fact, it's united us. And my personal view is that we've moved away from our tradition of federalism, and we're now seeking more and more policies to be decided at the national level. And that has actually caused more divisions in the United States as we've done that. So my view is that you have to allow for local differences. That doesn't mean that you set a precedent for some sort of autonomy or that sort of thing. With the precedent in Crimea, where it was an autonomous republic, then some people could argue that autonomy gave a pretext. I don't advocate for dividing a country up in a way that would fracture it or cause it to break apart. And certainly, I don't think that Crimea's status. It may have been a pretext, but it was a pretext. I mean, it was a Russian invasion. It wasn't a matter of that you allow that sort of degree of local control, and all of a sudden they vote to leave. It was an external invasion. So I don't. I take your point, and I don't advocate for breaking up Ukraine, but I do think that there has to be some accommodation for local differences. It's certainly the case in the United States that we're very divided right now, and I think part of that is due to the fact that we're trying to decide issues like healthcare, education that have an extremely personal impact on people's lives, and we're having a one-size-fits-all situation. If you think about a personal decision about what to have for dinner, sometimes as a family You can't all agree on what to have for dinner, but usually the parents rule it as it's not a democracy. The parents get to decide, but not everybody's always happy. But if you try to have an entire city have the same thing for dinner, or an entire country have the same thing for dinner, a lot of people are going to have something for dinner that they don't really like, and there's no reason why you all have to have the same thing for dinner. So, on important things like obviously, the national security and foreign policy. You have to have a single one, and you can have a strong sense of national identity and a strong foreign policy. But that doesn't mean that you have to mandate, for instance, that everybody speak the same language, or try to encourage people to. You can have regional differences in language. You're going to no matter what. We have differences in language in the United States. Sometimes I think we get lulled into thinking that we all speak the exact same language, and so when we don't understand each other, we don't know why, and it's because we do have some local differences, and we just you have to accept that and accommodate that in any country, in my view.
Thank you for that. And just a footnote to my China thing. You might be interested in this, since I know your boss is senator from Iowa, right? And they ship a lot of corn.
Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention ahead of time, but I am speaking on my own behalf and not on behalf of anybody else. It's very important for everybody to understand, so for the record.
At any rate, I just Googled something, and 5 years ago, China got 95% of its corn from the United States. They now get 95% of their corn from China. From Ukraine, China buys 95% of Ukraine's corn. Gets it from Ukraine rather than the United States. So I think to some extent, we kind of have a Western-centric view about discussing like what will happen in a region like Ukraine. And we have heretofore been able to play off Western institutions against Russia. But I just think that China is now a huge new player that's going to relegate the West to third-party sideliners. And they're really good. And like I said, not so much vis-a-vis confronting Russian influence. As a matter of fact, the Chinese, as you said, may be perfectly happy with Russia dominating. But basically saying, we want to supplant the Western influence economically first. And then obviously in broader terms.
My boss did do a speech on that on the Senate floor, if you want to look it up, about a month ago or so. So that's something that's a concern to him. He went to China about a month ago or so and came back very concerned about their very strategic approach to world affairs.
Your lecture about national identity. So can you tell about what the Ukrainian national identity in a couple sentences? For example, I give you an example of Russia. It's an evil empire controlled by dictators for the last 300 years. So give a national identity for Ukraine.
Well, as I said, I think the most unifying identity and the most important symbol is the Cossack identity. It's independent-minded people who want to chart their own course. That's what I see as sort of the unifying theme throughout all of Ukraine.
Okay, that's good. I want to be honest.
I want to say that lady about China. Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
Leonid Kravchuk, first Ukrainian president, he looked in our Chinese interests in Ukraine. Right? This bloody bastard was right in the beginning by Americans and destroyed Ukrainian army and nuclear weapons. And now he worked for China.
Interesting
Question.
Okay, so I don't personally know a lot about the Ukraine. I've never been there. But I saw a film which paints a kind of troubling picture on Ukraine. It's called Ukraine Burning. And I'm just trying to get your take on this. He portrays the leadership of Ukraine as kind of essentially fascist, or really nasty things in the past. What's your
That sounds like you maybe got that from Vladimir Putin. I mean, that's actually part of the old KGB playbook. To anybody that has any allegiance to the West, you call them a fascist. So that they do that to the Baltics. They do that to Ukraine. I don't think that's probably. I haven't seen the movie. I've seen some other Oliver Stone movies that were less than factually accurate. So
Great movie.
yeah, well, they're compelling entertainment, but I think they're entertainment. So I would discount them from that, which isn't to say that you can't find a Ukrainian who said something bad, or to say that Ukrainians are fascists or there's a long history of fascism. You have to keep in mind that that's being used as a narrative to discredit Western-leaning Ukrainians. There is a history during World War II and things but it's not the case that I think it's a pervasive issue the way Putin would have you believe.
It's a very good example of Russian propaganda. It's not Oliver Stone movie. He just made introduction. There is a director of this movie who is Ukrainian. This movie was made on Ukrainian money. They just took an interview, very small introduction from Oliver Stone, and they declared that this is a movie by Oliver Stone. He didn't see this movie either. So this is one more good example of manipulation. And this is on TV. Extremely, this Russian TV is Goebbels. I mean, he's an honest man in comparison with what they're telling him. So, and these movies, it's not only this movie, it's a lot about Georgia, Crimea, etc.
Could you speak to a little bit more to, you mentioned the Baltic states, like Lithuania and so forth. Can you speak a little bit more to their engagement and support of Ukraine? Because do you know about former Ambassador Petros Vaidikunas and his involvement in support of Ukraine, both for the Lithuanian government and also engaging now directly with the government of Ukraine?
I don't know specifically about that, but I know that all of the Baltics, that is a major part of their, they see a sort of, I don't know if responsibility is the right word, they're very interested in helping other countries sort of make the transition from the sort of post-Soviet sphere to fully Western democracy. So there are a lot of Balts that are very involved in that. A good friend of mine is Estonian who spent the last year in Kiev on a nonprofit that teaches Ukrainians coding to try to help develop the economy and civil society, because you can make Western salaries in Ukraine if you know how to do IT, and of course Estonians are very interested in IT and have made a name for themselves in that, and the other Balts are also similar. But all the Baltic countries too also tend to devote a lot of their, to the extent that they do foreign aid or efforts in the region, and so in fact, I attended after the Russian invasion of Crimea, I attended a protest in front of the Russian embassy that was hosted by the Joint Baltic American National Committee. So they take that very seriously. In fact, and last summer when I was in Estonia, there was a protest in front of the Russian embassy there. So it's something that they identify very strongly with, certainly the future of Ukraine.
Yeah. You mentioned a little while ago that federalism worked extremely well in the United States. It actually strengthened the country.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of counterintuitive, like the more independence you give to separate regions, the stronger the country becomes as a whole. That's counterintuitive, but very interesting. How do you see that playing out in Ukraine? I worked in Ukraine just 3 months ago. And what I noticed was in the West there's a very strong tendency towards independent municipalities. They want to work independently of Kiev. They're very nationalistic Ukrainian, but they want to be independent of Kiev. Central parts of Ukraine and eastern parts of Ukraine that we visited were very Soviet in their mentality. We want to know what the next steps are. We're waiting for Kiev to decide for us. So you do have very, very different sort of mentalities. Your statement about federalism working so extremely well in the United States, could you cast like what your image would be for Ukraine?
Well, I will say that I am not going to draft a constitution for them, and I don't think maybe federalism is the exact American model in the sense that we have different states that are gonna but I think more local control. That not everything has to be decided in Kiev, and I think actually maybe the municipality model is better than say carving up Ukraine into this region is going to have its own regional government, and that may not be helpful. It may not be easy to do. It's not a matter of, you know, they didn't start with 13 colonies and then come together. It's a very different history. So the American analogy works to a point, but it's obviously not perfect. It's a very different country. But I think the general principle of allowing for regional differences and not deciding things nationally that don't have to be applies. And I think probably the main thing I think of is in terms of language policy, maybe education to an extent that there can be some local control in that. That doesn't mean, to your point, that we should be making regional governments where they didn't exist, or where there's not a history of that, or it's not appropriate. So I'm speaking mainly to a general principle, as opposed to I'm going to come in and say I think this is how you should arrange your country.
Can you imagine local government in Catalonia, Castilla, Galicia, Vasconia, Andalusia? No. Spain, France, Normandy, Britain, Ile-de-France, Provence, Vasconia? No. In Poland, Kashuby, Mazury, Mazovshe? No. United States never tried to divide this country. Hitler
I don't think the United States should try to divide anybody.
Really?
I'm not advocating for U.S. foreign policy to tell Ukraine what they should do. I'm saying as a single person, this is my thought is that local control is like
all of us, we remember Sherman March to South, how North respond for Southern state, right to say. We're not completely different, but local government, okay? And we know what's happened in Balkans. In Balkans, what's happened? I was there. I saw in my eyes 320,000 people slaughtered. Okay? Now, same story tried to do it in Ukraine. And you know why? Why Balkans? Why Ukraine now? It's not war against Croats or Serbians or Kosovo or Ukrainians. It's war against Germany. If United States government really want to crush Russia, about European countries, 3 countries, Poland, they're very brave people.
Yeah.
Yeah, really. I have a lot of friction when I travel around Poland, when I have Ukrainian symbols. Many people say, you're pro-Nazi, you're terrible things during the Second World War. Yes, I told you, yeah, we did it. And you did it also against us. Because both of us, too much temper, Polish like Ukrainians, we love freedom. I don't care about my lifestyle, how many. I never, by the way, in my life, I almost say it with suits in town. I don't like this. But Polish army, Bundeswehr, and France, they can create European army and kick Russian army behind the Ural. United States doesn't want this. United States categorically against European army. Decades. I have feelings that American army in Germany not protect Germany or American freedom. No, occupied Germany controls them. 70 years after war, it's enough. Enough. And a lot of Polish people have nuclear weapons, what Ukraine can produce.
I disagree with that, certainly that impression. In fact, I think one actually interesting point is that I talked about the history of Ukraine playing off great powers against each other. I wouldn't carry that analogy too far in the sense that I don't see the United States and the West as another sort of imperial power. I think Russia under Putin certainly is, but the United States doesn't go and conquer and occupy countries with the intention of staying there or continuing to tell them what to do. The Russians will tell some of my Baltic friends that that, oh, you left our sphere and now you're just puppets of them. And they say, no, we actually begged them to come here. And when I was there, they were essentially asking for more American presence there. And that's because they want to be Western and they see the United States as the best guarantor of being able to preserve the sort of Western civilization and democracy. And so they I was going to say,
Well, just to that point, you were talking about the Baltic, and I was glad you brought it up because that's what I was hoping to hear you say regarding some of the Baltic, your experience with the Baltic areas, and which coincides, of course, with Poland and coincides also with so much of Ukraine. But yet, with all that desire for engagement with the West, with Europe, with with the U.S., North America, Canada too. A lot of Canadians involved in this. Why have we seen so tone deaf the Trump administration, and beyond tone deaf, decrying NATO, when the Baltic states have embraced it because of the situation? Why are we seeing such this pushback from this administration at a time when democracy should be something that we're waving our flag about?
I can't answer that. You would have to ask the spokesperson for the Trump administration, which I most certainly am not. But I think we've seen mixed messages. I think we should speak with one voice and say that we stand with these countries, and I think we have shown with our actions that we are prepared to defend Western democracies. The administration has actually agreed to sell lethal arms to Ukraine, and has moved troops to Poland, and we have some troops that come in to the Baltics. I certainly met with troops when I was there. They would like a permanent presence, because they believe that the American presence is more important than the Canadians or the Germans or even the British in terms of sending a message to Russia. I guess I was going to say on the European army is the point I was going to make, is that I think a European army doesn't have the same credibility. As I said, the Balts said that we're very glad to have the Germans. We don't want them replaced with Americans, but we also would like Americans to be there because that has credibility with the Russians. I don't think a Bundeswehr working with France is going to have the same credibility or deterrent factor. Anyway, well, thanks very much for everybody for coming, and thank you.